Hello, this is Kurt Soderberg, and I am going to present my findings for our statistical research assignment 3. For this, I have decided to look at the correlation coefficient between poverty level and the composite ACT, reading, ELA, math, and science. I guess the underlying question is poverty level an accurate predictor of ACT performance? As I got into the data, I got more and more interested in it. And so I looked at the correlation between each of the content areas as well. So, in other words, what potential impact relationship they have between each other. So the data set, I decided to look at national ACT scores, and I had never really paid attention to how many states tested in the ACT. I had heard that the East Coast didn't test much and so on. And but what I discovered was that truly there aren't many on the East Coast that use the ACT. But there are 17 states, Midwest, and actually quite a few Southern states, and even some Western states that test 100% of their students on the ACT. And so I felt this would be a really accurate sample size of the U.S., even for those states that maybe test 7, 8, 10, 12% of their students on the ACT. So this is a look at the data that I used, and you can see that the 17 states are listed there, and then you have poverty rate, the mean ACT composite scores, and then the benchmarks, and those are percents that are meeting benchmark in reading, English, math, and science. So the descriptive statistics around these, around this data set, I'm not going to go through them all. There's just a ton of them, but you can see all the standard, most important descriptive data here. The mean for the poverty rate is 14%. The mean for the ACT composite score is 19.52, and then you can see from there. So again, these are percentages of benchmark. Okay, standard error, again, across the board, you can see those. Probably standard deviation is the most important, at least in my consideration. That's one of the most important things that we need to know going into any type of statistic. So you can see those factors there. And then the count obviously is 17, as I had mentioned before. So lots of information there. But more importantly, I think for this is going to be looking at the other part of the data, which is the inferential part of the data. So this is, I didn't do this for all the comparisons, but I just wanted to show a scatter plot of the mean ACT composite and the poverty rate. So on the bottom, you can see the poverty rate in percentage and the ACT composite score there. So when you're looking at this tells us that they're at a 9% poverty rate, and and they scored a 20.4 on the ACT. So that blue dot marks that spot. And you can see as you look at the higher poverty rates on this end, their really scores are all over the place. I mean, here you have 17 basically percent poverty rate, and they're at a 20.2. And oops, sorry about that. And one of the things I really liked about the 100% test is that it's essentially all students tested. And obviously, there's some opt-out options there for severely disabled students and so on. But at any rate, this looks at a very large population of the school, virtually 100% of those kids that are testable. I gave you a little sneak preview of this, but this is, I thought these were a couple charts that are important to just remind us of what we're looking at. And so when you look at a correlation coefficient, it shows the strength and the direction. So I thought this chart here shows that really well. So we work from 0 to +1 and 0 to -1, and it depends on what you're looking at. Some of my resources said is from 0 to 0.2 in either direction is weak. And then as you move away from 0.2 either direction, the relationship gets stronger. But one concept that's important to note is that even though it's a negative number, that is a strong correlation. So the strength it's strong. It just tells us that it's a negative correlation if it's obviously a negative number. So let's say we have a negative 0.9. That's a very strong correlation, but it simply says that it's a negative correlation. And so that, for example, in this case, if our poverty rate goes up, then the other one will go down. So as as poverty rate goes up, ACT composite goes down. That's a negative correlation. If it was at 0.98 down in this area, that's a very, very strong negative correlation. And just the opposite is true if it's the other direction. So a 0.98 to the positive side would be a strong correlation, but a positive correlation, so that as whatever we're comparing sample X or characteristic X, if that goes up, then we could expect characteristic Y or whatever we term that would go up as well, because it's a positive correlation. And then these are just a little bit of and here you can see they give a 0.4, a 0, and a negative 0.4. So that's kind of maybe that spot where maybe the midpoint. I put this in here because I thought it was kind of an interesting way to look at it. So I didn't show it on here, but this is essentially the 0 mark. And going back to that last diagram, moving to the right takes us out to 1. So because we're comparing poverty rate to all the rest of these and coming up with our coefficient, then poverty rate compared to poverty rate is going to be a 1. It's going to be very, very strong and positive because it's the same thing. So working from that, if you can just picture that as a 0, you can see the coefficient is actually the Pearson correlation coefficient. You can see the strength of those connections. And I'm going to show you in a much better way here in a second, but that just gives you an idea. So I really like this chart because it's, I think, fairly easy to read once we know what we're looking for. So we have poverty rate and all the categories across the top. Sorry about that. All the categories across the top, and then we have the same thing, all the categories across the side. So when you're looking at this, poverty rate compared to poverty rate, your coefficient is going to be a 1 because it's the same thing. And we covered that a couple minutes ago. When you look at poverty rate compared to mean ACT composite score, it's a negative 0.28. So when we go back and look at that chart, it's somewhere in here. And so it's a weak correlation, and it's negative. So we know, at least from that information, that as the poverty rate goes up, we can expect ACT composite to go down, but it's a weak relationship. But the relationship that is there is negative, so it's going to go down. They're going to work opposite of each other. Poverty rate goes up, mean ACT will go down. But this is not a real strong relationship. And then here you can see there's very weak relationship between poverty rate and reading, English, math, and science. There's some surprising information there, I think. I was really surprised by those numbers. I'm going to jump past the ACT composite because it's kind of obvious that, well, anyway, that relationship should be fairly obvious. But then we get into some other ones where, and I'm sorry, I color-coded this based on strength. So obviously green is going to be very strong. The orange is moderately strong. And then this kind of light yellow, I guess, or tan wants to be stronger, but is not there yet. So still weak. But if we pay attention to this, I find this really interesting that the reading in the reading area compared to English, there's a strong correlation there. Very similar with math and reading, and then science. And we can speculate why that is, but in my reviews of the ACT and prepping our kids for the ACT and even the Aspire, science is a lot of reading. It's a lot about vocabulary and reading charts and understanding a short paragraph. And that's something that I think is why it really relates closely to that. So here you have a strong correlation, which let's focus on science and reading. So as my reading ability goes up or skill goes up, my science scores should increase as well. And you can see the same thing here with English, and the correlation is still strong. And obviously, not surprising, math and science are very closely related in the correlation. Very strong relationship and in a positive direction. So I broke this down a little bit more. So we've got, again, poverty rate, and here's that same chart that I just went through. So I'm not going to go through that in a ton of detail, but it's another way that I would use to help if this is a school board presentation or parents or even our teachers. I think this is really an important way to go through it. Give different people that learn differently a chance to see it in different formats. So that's the poverty rate. I skipped over the composite score, but here's our reading correlation. Again, this particular format allows me to say, hey, let's go down to science. We're at a 0.96. That puts us over here. And so we're very strong and we're in a positive direction. Again, I would reemphasize that as reading scores go up, if we can impact reading, we can impact science. Same thing with English. You can take a look at English and how it correlates. Again, I think English, it's not reading specifically, but it's in that same area. So the impact on science is still strong there as well. And it is on math as well. And then here's math to science. And that was a 0.948. These are all the same numbers you saw before. And again, just another way to look at it. So the resource I used is from the ACT, and had a couple other resources that I looked at, but it really ended up being this one. Our state ACT information wasn't helpful in this case, but it was a very interesting study. I hope you found the material interesting, and probably the best thing was coming out of it. Maybe you understand a little bit more about correlation coefficients. Appreciate your time. Looking forward to the feedback.